Hi, everyone. Thanks for your patience. We're off to a little bit of a late start. Thanks for joining us at e-flux for Thinking Matter, Thinking Body, Thinking Hands with our guests Emmanuel Alborg, Maria Czechonadsky, and Alexei Penzin. The evening tonight relates to the work of renowned Marxist and Soviet philosopher Ewald Ilyenkov, who lived from 1924 to 1979. We'll start with a lecture by Alexei on Ilyenkov's essay Cosmology of the Spirit, and his lecture is titled Thinking Matter in the Universe, Ewald Ilyenkov's Communist Cosmology. Then we'll be screening Emmanuel's 2006 teen film, Talking Hands, about Ilyenkov's Zagorsk School for Deaf-Blind Children, which he established in the 1960s outside Moscow. And following that, we will have Emmanuel in conversation with Maria, and we hope you will stay on and join in the discussion. By way of introduction, Emmanuel Alborg is an artist based in Stockholm and London. He works in a wide range of media with a focus on the moving image. He finished the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York in 2015, and is currently a PhD candidate at the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm. His work has been recently shown at the Kiev Biennial, at the Biennale de Sao Paulo, and at Whitechapel Gallery in London. Maria Czechonadsky is a philosopher and critic. She received her PhD in philosophy at the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy, Kingston University, in 2017. Her research and work concentrates on Soviet epistemologies across Marxist philosophy, literature, and art, as well as on post-Soviet politics. She has published in journals and magazines such as Radical Philosophy, South Atlantic Quarterly, Crisis and Critique, e-flux Journal. I think the essay is called The Stofflichkeit of the Universe, Bogdanov and the Soviet Avant-Garde, Mute, and Moscow Art Magazine. In 2014, she co-curated together with Ilya Budraitskis the exhibition Shadow of a Doubt at the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, and it was dedicated to the topic of conspiracy. She lives and works in London. Alexei Penzin teaches at the University of Wolverhampton in the UK, and is also a research associate at the Institute of Philosophy of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. Penzin is a member of the collective Что делать, or in English, What is to be done. His research has been published in the journals Rethinking Marxism, Crisis and Critique, Mediations, South Atlantic Quarterly, and e-flux Journal, among others. He co-edited the English translation of the book Art and Production by Boris Arvatov, which I think is one of the very few works available by Arvatov in English. And several articles. Published by Pluto Press in 2017. And one of the key, who is one of the key theorists of the Soviet avant-garde. Currently, he's preparing his book Against the Continuum, Sleep and Subjectivity in Capitalist Modernity, to be published by Bloomsbury Academic. Please join us in welcoming Alexei Penzin.
Yes, thank you for invitation, and I think it's a great event. Not just my lecture, but the whole thing, the film screening and conversation around Ilyenkov, which will be somehow revolving around this very interesting figure in Soviet philosophy. So, in my lecture, I will try to focus on his text, which is recently was published. So it wasn't translated until recently, but it was recently published in English, so you can find the full text. So it's I offer a sort of reading of this text, trying to link it to some contemporary philosophical debates. And for me, I think, because definitely it's difficult to introduce Ilyenkov for this minimal 30 minutes I have, maybe 35. So I thought that it's better to introduce Ilyenkov through this very specific, particular text, which was written by him when he was in very young age. He was, I think, in his post-PhD time. It was early 50s. And it's very remarkable text because it's very, very speculative. It has a kind of a little bit, judging even on my title, which is much more humble than Ilyenko's, it's like poses a sort of question about what would be communist cosmology, how we could understand communism as not just a local planetary event, but how it would be rather related to the whole cosmological problem. So, cosmology is like a long tradition in modern European philosophy, when philosophers speculate, probably not knowing so much science, speculate about what is, how our universe is organized, what it would be its metaphysical or post-metaphysical foundations, and since, I don't know, Descartes, Kant, all of them, Kant has this sort of cosmological treatise. So it's a long existing philosophical tradition of this philosophical cosmology. And this is a kind of very peculiar cosmology because it's somehow very closely linked to the idea of communism, what would mean in this sort of cosmological scale. That's why I was, when the first time I read this text, I was really properly amazed by this text, and I was really shocked. I would say, philosophy usually somehow linked. Philosophy, tend to occupy the whole. So philosophy usually linked to this sort of feeling of intellectual dialectical change. When you're reading philosophical texts, you can be really surprised or somehow overwhelmed by this. I think Aristotle already noted this, and Marx noted that probably philosophy begins with a feeling of amazement, but sometimes it also ends with this feeling, like joking about this Aristotle expression. So it's very interesting text. I mean that, and it's a very good entry point into Ilyenkov. So just to go through the main argument of this text and this context, when this text emerged in the Soviet Union in 50s, and very specific content of this context of this time, as you know, probably there is a sort of clear divisions between usually discussed between the sort of Soviet Marxism, which was unredeemably dogmatic, and more creative Western Marxism, which was free from all this dogmatic limitation put on Soviet Marxism. So this long story which comes from the time of Cold War, and of course there were acknowledged many creative elements in Soviet Marxism already, but I think Ilyenkov Marxism in this stage, in this very early text, I wouldn't call it even creative, I would call it rather speculative Marxism, in the sense that he really tackles a lot of these issues which were not typical even for creative Western Marxism. Like in Frankfurt School, Adorno wasn't discussing the cosmology or how universe will develop in billion years, and he was just focused on this more different specific aspects of late capitalist culture and rereading some philosophical figures, of course. So it was also not typical for creative Western Marxism to tackle this topic of, which would be one of Ilyenkov texts. So, what else, sort of preliminaries about this? Also, it was a whole Soviet actually discourse in 50s. It was between this sort of late Stalinism and post-Stalinist time in 50s, when it was a lot of this sort of speculative discussions, debates. So it was definitely not just Ilyenkov about this, what means communism on a larger scale, what will happen. So people were in these very specific conditions in Soviet Union after Second World War, when they sometimes, due to the specific limitations and restrictions of public debate, they couldn't discuss probably some topics, but they had the opportunity to discuss these very speculative, very big questions, like what will happen after we'll get communism? Because now some of these questions seems unimaginable even in the current condition, when you probably couldn't even dare to ask the question what will happen when we achieve the communism, or better to ask some more specific question, what will happen next presidential term, like won't be, I don't know, some figures disappear from this, or what would be more cuts, more austerities or not. So this much more his specific question of today. So Ilyenkov basically was influenced, of course, by this discourse, but his position within the Soviet discourse, more you can say utopian, though I wouldn't say that's a proper word, like utopian, abstract discussion. Maybe it could be used, but I don't like the particular term, but it's rather speculative discourse, I would say. So Ilyenkov was definitely influenced, but his position is also determined not by his very, how to say, good knowledge of the history of philosophy, since, I don't know, modern philosophy, Spinoza, Hegel, and Marx, of course, and he tries to construct his text called Cosmology of the Spirit as a sort of strict philosophical, well-argued treaty or tract when he proposed some argument in a very dense way, and so on and so on. Here is, by the way, some photographs. I wanted to show this in his younger age. He was a soldier during the Second World War. He is here, like in Berlin, after May 45, I think. Here is in his young age. Here is more older. And this is a typed manuscript. It's in Russian. Typed manuscript of his work, Cosmology of the Spirit. So I would like to just to try to present the argument of this text, and then to link it with some contemporary discussions in, as I said, in philosophy. So basically, as I said, these questions are very crucial for any philosophy. So the materialist philosophy, the question is, what is the sort of function of human intelligence or thought in the material universe? Is thought, which can be understood loosely as a collective human intelligence, necessary for matter, which is also an important question for any materialist philosopher, how it is related to matter, or is it kind of rather contingent outcome of evolution or any sort of process which forms life and an intelligence on the earth? Or it could be also phrased in the language of Spinoza. As you know, Spinoza had this specific ontology which considered matter as thought as an attribute of matter, because it was a sort of materialist interpretation of Spinoza and Ilyenkov, and there is a sort of infinite substance which is matter, and he rather considers thought as a sort of attribute, so necessary quality of matter, so somehow necessarily linked to matter and as its attribute. So, and another question, as I said, what we may be able to achieve communism, but what then? So it's a kind of paradoxical question, which is, again, it sounds crazy today. What's after communism? Yeah, kind of this impossible question now. What after? Not just because now, definitely, if we may able to achieve communism is also a question which is somehow on the margins on contemporary philosophical theoretical debate. And Ilyenkov somehow dwells on this question in his work, and this is probably too early to put this slide. And so Ilyenkov somehow starts his argument from this very fundamental question: what is how to say, relations between matter and thought? How would be sort of philosophical response if we consider this question on the sort of cosmological scale? And he's very conscious about this very kind of wild speculative nature of his text. That's why his texts are full of various reservations. He calls his thoughts, ideas like hypotheses. He calls them a sort of, even the subtitle reads as cosmology of the spirit, and attempt to give a basic outline of the objective role of thinking matter in the system of universal interaction. So matter in the universe, and then in brackets a philosophical poetic phantasmagoria based on the principles of dialectical materialism. And he always, through the text, he says, no, I'm completely, how to say, pledging his adherence to dialectical materialism. So he says that it strictly follows from what he was going to say, it strictly follows from dialectical materialism, and probably even Stalin would approve this, but he never published this text during his this live, how to say, because it was of this sort of nature, and this text was published only posthumously in the 80s after his death already. So not because it was somehow dissident, but it was rather somehow breaking out from this framework of even though acceptable sort of dialectical materialism. So basically, the text suggests a cosmological hypothesis, we can say like this, which links together first the emergence of life and human intelligence on the Earth, second, the specific debate on entropic nature of the material universe, and third point is the historical achievement of communism, as it was just said. So about entropic nature of the universe, just maybe to give a first brief remark about this, then I probably can relate this later. He relies to the debates which embrace both science and philosophy since 19th century about the entropy, second law of thermodynamics. This main idea is that with the entropy is a sort of measure of disorder in any given material system, and it can only grow. And consequence of this would be probably final end event, which usually related as a entropic death of the universe. So like everything cooled down, and there is no any further way to go. So it's like returning to a sort of standstill, like absolute equilibrium at the zero level without any further development. And Engels, Friedrich Engels, as you know, one of the co-founder of Marxism, discusses this question in the 19th century already in his book Philosophy of Nature, and which definitely interesting to know because we know Engels as a sort of optimistic co-author of Communist Manifesto, but he was thinking about such things as a sort of final entropic death of the universe. And he discussed this, in very specific, he knows very well this even physical debates around this question. Though there is still a debate in the literature that if Engels really supported this entropy and then thermal death of universe hypothesis, or not fully, so or he supported just this general scientific law of thermodynamics and had some doubts about this final thermal death of the universe. So and Ilyenkov's heavily relying on this text of Engels. So again, it's his tool of expressing his idea with sort of authoritative source, which was acceptable and in this specific situation. And he starts his argument with the assumption, this sort of statement that which reads as matter constantly possesses thought, constantly thinks itself. So that doesn't mean literally that, like in contemporary theories, like sort of post-Deleuzean thought, we can discuss sort of smart matter, which is self-organizing or something. He rather refers to specific cosmological hypothesis that if a form of matter had already emerged in human shape and developed to the human intelligence by the very law of probability that given that the universe is infinite, there always there is a spot in the universe where this emergence already happened. So this sort of speculative argument he uses, but not just this is the core of his argument. We will see that he develops it in many other respects. so in Spinozian language, again, because he used Spinoza, and of course I'm simplifying his argument here, so he doesn't mean matter as a specific aspect of our view at material universe, but rather matter as a whole, as a sort of infinite substance which has this dimension of thought as its attribute. So the second comment which is interesting here, that he understands how Soviet philosophy in Soviet dialectical materialism was describing what is matter, how we understand what is matter, material substance. It was understanding also in this kind of Engelsian way as a sort of ensemble of various forms of movement, as a sort of ascending hierarchy from the lowest forms of movement like physical, chemical interaction to the highest form, which is human brain, thought, and it's kind of social form of matter, which because brain and thinking are also somehow able some connectivity and production of this sort of social form of movement. And but the Ilyenkov twist in this is that this ascending movement or development of forms of matter is always limited. So we have the lowest forms and then probably highest form, which is thinking or intelligent. I would call this idea like a paradox of development. So we have some development from lower forms of matter to highest forms, but then it's over. So though matter is infinite, still its forms of development has some limitations. And exactly at this point, not just by low probabilities that always like in, I don't know, contemporary mass media speculation, you can find an argument, of course, the universe is infinite and always will be some forms of life somewhere there and so on and so on. But more philosophically, his idea about necessity of thought in the universe somehow linked to the idea of this infinity of matter, which somehow still linked to the fact that its forms of development are limited. Yeah, this is a sort of kind of ontological point in his argument. Or again, to use this Spinozian language, so like Spinoza was saying that substance is like kaleidoscope, so which is remains unchanged. Also, its constituent parts they somehow incessantly move like pieces in this kaleidoscope. So Ilyenkov has a similar view. So the substance as a whole is in the state of homeostasis. But rather his idea how this homeostasis can be achieved is very different. I would say somehow he twisting Spinoza here, as we hopefully see if you in the further argument. The question which Ilyenkov asked, okay, so if according to more standard or vulgar materialism, thought is somehow emerges from the movement of matter as its highest form, but it's not always clear is this development to highest form is necessary or not. It could be rather contingent. Like, you know, there are a lot of references to this contingency of emergence of thought and life in contemporary, or since Nietzsche, who has similar points, like in some planet emerges some life which has capacity of thinking, and also assumes that the whole universe is somehow revolving around this thinking life, but still it's just a contingent, a small-scale operation of thinking, some planet, Nietzsche says, approximately, like I'm trying to say, in his text about truth and lie in non-ethical sense. So Ilyenkov tries to argue that it's by some reason, matter cannot exist without thought. So it's not just somehow matter produces thought at some point of its development, but rather it cannot exist without thought. The question is how these sort of assumptions his premises he's somehow discussing here, how they they link to understanding of what is thinking itself. Is the thinking able to be something necessary, have some efficiency in the world? Or maybe at some stage of development of the world. Or it's just a sort of contingent outcome, which could be like, it could happen, could not, and so on and so on. So for him, it's important to find an argument, not just statistical or stochastic arguments that by the law of probability, it's always will be some form of strange thinking life somewhere, but rather what would be efficient function of thought in this cosmological scale. And there is, if we given that there is this movement of matter from lowest form to highest forms, this movement should be, he argues, like a cyclical. So there is a sort of movement from lowest form to highest form, and then probably back to this sort of regression movement. So this sort of ontology he operates here. The point he is making that at some point, by this sort of entropic movement, the matter will somehow face its own sort of 0 point of development, which is usually referred to as thermal death of the universe. And something should happen here. And this is very interesting, another twist of his argument. Somehow changes the whole situation. So his speculative hypothesis is that exactly here, at this point of collapse or regress of the matter to its lower forms, which seems to be somehow irreversible, leading to this exactly this 0 point without any further development, here, exactly at this point, thought or human intelligence should somehow play a role. And this leads him to this quite, how to say, provoking hypothesis. What this short thought in human intelligence should do in this process. Actually, I heard this quick summary of this text of Ilyenkov from a friend in a party. It was rather sort of kind of anecdote or joke, because the question was also, okay, we achieved communism, it was an activist, and remember this conversation, what will happen after? And then he said, haha, Ilyenkov proposes that after communism should destroy itself. After achieving this stage of full communism, communism should destroy itself. And I was wondering, what does it mean? And of course, after that I read this text. And Ilyenkov's suggestion, indeed, that at this point of sort of zero point of this development, which is close to thermal death, and to provide this new cycle of movement of matter, what in physics usually referred to as Big Bang. But no, because according to Ilyenkov, he wasn't able to find an evidence in physical theories how to explain this transition from the 0 point, like thermal death, to Big Bang. What happens between them? This is a big question. And until now, there is a lot of speculation, of course, in science. So it's a kind of discussed topic. And of course, it could be somehow there is a lot of refutations of this hypothesis of thermal death, and so on and so on. But Ilyenkov was thinking, here, exactly here, should something happen between this thermal death moment and the new Big Bang. I can just show you better the quote, how he describes, this is a quote from Engels, which is also a very nice quote, kind of melancholic quote from the Dialectic of Nature. So it tells that about inevitable thermal death of the universe. Which it's quite well-known quote, actually. So this is Ilyenkov proposal. So he actually, you can read it from the screen, or I can just read it for you. So what he says here, in concrete terms, one can imagine it like this: at some peak point of their development, thinking beings executing their cosmological duty and sacrificing themselves produce a conscious cosmic catastrophe. Provoking a process, a reverse thermal dying of cosmic matter. That is provoking a process leading to the rebirth of dying worlds by means of cosmic cloud of incandescent gas into vapors. The text is from early 50s. So in simple terms, which is also a very interesting expression, in simple terms, like discussing this sort of scale of event, he says, thought turns to be out to be a necessary mediating links, thanks only to which the fiery rejuvenation of universal matter becomes possible. It proves to be this direct, efficient cause that leads to the instant activation of endless reserves of interconnected motion in similar matter to how it currently initiates a chain reaction. So he means nuclear reaction. Of course, 50s was already, this was also very much discussed. Artificially destroying small quantity of core radioactive elements. So basically, his hypothesis that in this stage to somehow provide a further opportunity for moving this sort of cosmic machine and achieving a highest powers, the human intelligence is able to somehow relaunch this sort of relaunch this machine in a way. Yes. So and then it's very crucial part of the quote. This being said, thought remains a historically transitional episode in the development of the universe, a derivative secondary product of the development of matter, but a product that is absolutely necessary by this move. A consequence that simultaneously becomes a condition for the existence of infinite matter. So here we come to this sort of core of his speculative argument that the necessary link between thought and being, and not again it could be said in being, but rather matter for Ilyankov, is that thought is a sort of important, crucial element in this sort of cosmological machine. So it is necessary for this sort of this kind of ontology of the universe would be able to unfold itself endlessly. So thought is a sort of this, and this sense, of course, it's not strictly Spinozian view of the universe, because for Spinoza, such events wouldn't be possible in his ontological system. Rather, it's not about events. And but paradoxically. Paradox of Ilyankov he introduced here is rather retroactively this ontology becomes sort of Spinozian. So thought becomes a necessary attribute of matter. So this is his argument here, and of course. This self-destruction of reason, self-destruction of thought is also linked Ilyankov links it to the idea of communism. So only under communism, the condition for this function of thought will be provided, will be created, because definitely capitalist system is not thinking about this sort of self-sacrificial explosion and something like this. So in this sense, it's this sort of real kind of putting communism on this sort of cosmological scale as a sort of as a precondition of thought for thought to become a sort of necessary attribute in this cosmological of matter in this cosmological picture. So this is basically the key arguments. Also to comment on this idea that somehow without intervention of a communist subject, we can say it like this, like thought, which is a communist, in the end is a communist subject, it is impossible to somehow for the universe to exist. And this is definitely also somehow echoes Lenin's position, mostly political position, because they always were somehow linked to this sort of interventionist approach to political. Because you know that Lenin was debated this with other currents in Russian Bolshevism or social democracy, starting from his work, What is to be Done because he was struggling with this economist that defended the idea that the conditions for revolutionary subjectivation of the proletariat are determined by objective economic development. And but in opposition to this, Lenin was emphasized the subjective intervention of the party intellectuals who will have to bring working class its sort of radical consciousness. And I think Ilyenkov somehow projects this sort of Leninist interventionalist approach into sort of cosmological realm here. So, also definitely. So in his stress, I think I have another slide about this quote about communism and it has a lot of beautiful quotes. This text I chosen only these two. So millions of years will pass. Actually, here, if you remember Engels' quote, he gives the rephrasing of Engels' quote. Millions of years will pass, thousands of generations will be born and go to the graves, a genuine human system will be established on Earth, which is the conditions for activity, a classless society, a spiritual material culture, and blah, blah, blah. And then that can only fulfill this, and only on this basis, humankind can fulfill this great sacrificial duty before nature. For us, the people living at the dawn of human prosperity, the struggle for this future will remain the only real form of service to the highest aim of thinking spirit. So you, again, from contemporary point of view, I mean, presumably somehow critical, maybe ironic, what would be the approach to this from the side of contemporary reader? And there could be different reaction and could be different interpretations of this text. Of course, it has this sort of mythological kind of aspect, which linked to this sort of what he calls global fire, or it's like the Promethean mythology and so on and so on. But I think it's not as important as some other aspects. So you can say, okay, it's a sort of strange speculative fantasy, but at the same time, it has much more interesting content implied here, I think, because it could be also called, if you know, in German idealism, its early stage, it was a famous oldest systematic program of German idealism, which somehow introduced the idea of mythology of reason. So how to transfer this sort of complicated philosophical ideas to more broader public, and young Hegel, Schelling, and presumably Gödelin, there is no authorship debate, it's still running on. They suggest that could be sort of mythology of reason, which somehow can translate abstract philosophical ideas into sort of mythological, more sensible images. So this aspect is also very important, I think, in Ilyenkov. I think another interpretation would be linking Ilyenkov's text as a sort of expression of this, what was late socialism or mature socialism in Soviet in this post-Second World War stage, because I would say that it was somehow the speculative nature of this text, maybe, which could seem completely wild today, or naive, maybe. It's very much based on this specific conditions, as I already noticed, this sort of specific restrictions, specific conditions which puts thinking and linguistic expression outside of market forces, giving them a sort of speculative freedom. So you are thinking not to feed to some specific market requirement, what is discussed, should be discussed today, given this sort of academic or political whatever debate, but it was leaving people a lot of time for thinking and opportunities to think these very abstract questions, which would again be looking as a kind of exceeding the scale of reasonable today. So this is, for example, Boris Groys in his book, which I like, Communist Postscript, speaks of this sort of speculative aspect of this sort of Soviet epistemic conditions based on paradox, on these big questions, big issues, and so on and so on and so on. So also, I think this text could be also interpreted in a sort of Foucauldian sense, because cosmology also has, in late Foucauldian sense, cosmology also has a sort of ethical or political aspect. So, Foucault, if you know, his later work was about ethics or care, what he called care of the self, and his later work. But he has any interesting notes about functions of cosmology or functions of physics, or how we present ourselves, our physical universe, is political aspects of this. So, for example, even for Stoics, physics and cosmology were the sort of not just discourse or knowledge, they were a sort of meditative exercise, practice which somehow detached subject from immediate narrow environment and allowed the subject to sort of ascend to this contemplative position. And this, through this, I think, Foucauldian optics, this text could be seen as a sort of meditative exercise of communist subject, which considers about transience of all things, including communists, and this sort of kind of final explosive move, which somehow constitute this subject. So, but I think about the last points maybe I can make in this paper if I have some time, 5 minutes, okay. This, I think, it's also this set of ideas which might seem as sort of really going beyond measure and so on. They are kind of sort of philosophical importance, I think. And first, as I was noting in passing, this relation between Ilyenkov and Spinoza. I'm not sure that I have time to discuss the relation between Ilyenkov and Hegel, because he was also much within this Hegelian philosophy, though it's a different aspect. So, but I think he continued to work on Spinoza in his more mature, more known work, and he tried to sort of elaborate their materialist version of dialectics based on interpretation of philosophical classics since Descartes through Spinoza, German idealism to Marx and Lenin. And he also sort of repeats this materialist interpretation of Spinoza, suggesting that sort of understanding of thought as a sort of necessary attribute of material substance, which seems somehow distant from vulgar understanding of materialism. But he never returns to this strange idea of event, which somehow proves this necessity of thought, which is this final event of self-destruction of communist reason. You can say it like this, sort of paradoxical self-denial or self-destruction, self-negation of dialectical self-negation of this communist subject. And Spinoza is Spinozian, more technical Spinozian language. You can say that Spinoza distinguished between attribute and mode. So attribute is a sort of necessary quality of substance, and mode is more contingent. It's like basically this sort of modification of material substance, so basically all the things we are seeing around us. And somehow the problem of Ilyenkov's cosmology is like how a finite mode, which is human intelligence, can become a sort of infinite attribute, which is a sort of Spinozian understanding of attribute. And this somehow reminds sort of recent interpretation by Spinoza by Alain Badiou, for example, who also tried to twist Spinoza to find the sort of gaps in his philosophical ontology. He has some works, he has some articles and papers on Spinoza which are interesting. And he also considers, try to spot in Spinoza sort of implicit and paradoxical Spinozism, which would be based on the idea of event. So Spinoza seems incompatible with the whole idea of event as a rupture or sort of emergence, but you hints to some understanding of Spinoza from what he called event torsion, so from some aspect of event. And because in Spinoza there is this problem of, so he also thinks in some letters, Spinoza mentions some modes which can be infinite, which is kind of specific idea. And here Badiou spots this sort of this possibility of transition or sort of inconsistence or void between Spinozian understanding of finite and infinite. So this he spots this sort of opportunity for modification or torsion of Spinozism. So and Ilyenkov, I would say again, somehow. This sort of self-deconstruction or self-destruction of communist reason or thought is for this sort of saving matter from entropy, would be somehow suggest this sort of transition from thought which is understood as a finite mode, as collective human intelligence, into sort of infinite mode, to sort of collective human intelligence in this stage of communism, and then to becoming a sort of necessary and infinite attribute of matter in this sort of singular event of relaunching of the universe, putting it on what he calls global fire. So this is sort of the communism in Ilyenkov understood as a sort of this short circuit or transition, singular transition from finite to infinite. This would be sort of my reading of this sort of implicit Spinozism of this text. And this is more interesting than this sort of more maybe sort of science fiction-based speculation and so on. And I would say that this also provides grounds for more critical stance to some debates in the framework of, as I mentioned already, this sort of new materialism with the idea of smart matter, or this sort of speculative orientations in contemporary philosophy, which is like very prominent the last maybe 7, 8, 10 years. And the Ilyenkov proposal has a very specific distinctive feature, which is somehow based on links, this sort of speculative, sometimes wild speculation, to this question or idea of communism, which I think is very, very important. So the communism is a sort of event which somehow implies this sort of singularity, which transforms this sort of Spinozian ontology into something else. So or retroactively constitutes this sort of Spinozian ontology where matter and thought are somehow somehow our thought is necessary attribute of material substance. Given this contemporary discussion, which try rather separate thought and matter, like I mean this sort of Miyasu discussion of correlationism, like we should somehow separate matter and thought, those subject and object, and try to think about a material universe not from the point of human thought, but rather from the sort of more contingent or external point of view. And in this sense, I think what Ilyenkov proposed, or I had another quote from text by Jean-François Lyotard, which was published in '80s, which called "Can Thought Go On Without Body?" It's also the same circle of thoughts about future thermal death of the universe. So, like 40 years later, the sun is getting older, it will explode, and so on and so on, and and even it will be and this extinction of this thermal death of sun, and it will be even not clear can we fix this event, because there will be no witness not intelligence which would be able to register this event, because this event is sort of limit event which distinguishes even any being which would be able to register this event. And Lyotard's response again is we have to separate thought and the body. So his response is rather this kind. And then he speculates in terms of artificial intelligence. So this survival of intelligence is possible when we separate body and thought, because body is affected by this material entropic process. And thought could probably escape it through taking some artificial or immaterial form. So this also, he produced a kind of speculative dialogue in this text, which is interesting. And there is a later book by Ray Brassier, Nihil and Bound, Enlightenment and the Extinction, which he also discussed in comments on this text of Lyotard, somehow linking this to the idea of sort of nihilism which unfolds. So paradoxically, enlightenment brings us to nihilism because it unfolds as only one truth, the truth of final extinction, which is achieved through sort of science and scientific work. And Ilyenkov point is vice versa different. So exactly, we need not to separate the thought and like Meillassoux or Lyotard or Brassier somehow implies in their discussion of this problem, but rather he suggests that only under condition of communism, thought and material substance finally can achieve proper relation. Thought can become a sort of necessary attribute of the substance. So this is so that's why I think the proposal of Ilyenkov, based on this implicit, or like Meillassoux says, we can imagine the world without thought, without thinking. So this is, I think, is very important proposal in contemporary debates around these questions. And I don't know if probably I don't have any more time, but the sun will explode in 4.5 billion years, so we have a lot of time in the end. Yeah? So, okay, and then probably you can just return to some points of this in discussion. And I can say that to link with the film, that Ilyenkov definitely, because he considered communism not as something, okay, we have a nice kind of, we overcame capitalism and we have a sort of life which is based of equality, sort of de-alienation or whatever, but also the communism is somehow transitionary stage. So it's like a stage to something bigger, which he describes as this sort of hypothesis. But still, to prepare this communist subject, Ilyenkov was very, very much interested in the question of pedagogy and how how to make these appropriated social and intellectual wealth to be appropriate by particular specific human subjects. So communist pedagogy was for him the question how to appropriate thought, which was created, not just material wealth which humanity constructed during its history, but technologies, whatever, but rather how to thought could be appropriated by each individual. That was his sort of way of to pedagogy. So, and then Till will show you some parts of this, and so on, and then we can continue discussing this. Huh? So, hope I'm afraid, was it this interesting? I just was going to ask you immediate feedback, not for me, but rather to prove my hypothesis that Ilyenkov is a very important thinker, even in his most wild aspects. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, I just want to give one very, very short introduction to the film. The film is about the Zagorsk School for deafblind children that Ilyenkov was involved in the 60s and 70s. And the main protagonist in the film is Alexander Suvorov. He was a student at the school as a child, and he then studied with Ilyenkov until the late 70s. So Ilyenkov was a kind of mentor to him, and the history and the ideas around the school is narrated through him. So yeah, afterwards I will have a conversation with Maria, and we can clarify some things and maybe make some connections back to Alexei's talk as well. Thank you.
Objects created by human labor mediate culture, and as we learn to utilize them through socially developed methods, we shape our minds.
Вещи, созданные человеческим трудом, опосредуют культуру. И когда мы учимся их использовать посредством развитых обществом методов, мы формируем наше сознание.
Mecheryakov writes, "A child's mind takes shape and develops as a result of its interaction with the world of things and the world of people. The things with which a child interacts are the products of human labor. The essence of interaction with things and people consists in the fact that in both cases, this is interaction with a human factor."
Пишет Мещеряков.
Activity with objects is essential for the development of the human mind. This understanding is attributed to Marx's idea that for an individual being, the appropriation of the object is the appropriation of human reality, and that through the human activity of transforming nature, he transforms himself.
Это осуществление на деле человеческой действительности. Он также пишет, что деятельное изменение природы человеком изменяет его самого.
The example of the spoon as an initial and essential object is reoccurring in both Ilyenkov and Mecheryakov. A spoon is an object of human culture, with which a specific mode of action is firmly linked. It dictates a specific action to the child, and when he learns this action and performs it, the child is performing an act of human behavior.
Ложка – предмет человеческой культуры. За ней закреплен определенный способ действия. Она диктует ребенку определенное действие. Обучаясь этому действию и совершая его, ребенок совершает акт человеческого поведения, пишет Мещеряков.
The spoon is a first step on the path of mental development and a first cultural tool. Ilyenkov writes, "A spoon is a path into the realm of human social culture, into the sphere of human life activity and of the human mind."
Ложка – это и есть пропуск в царство человеческой социальной культуры, в сферу человеческой жизнедеятельности и психики, пишет Ильенков.
He later continues, as Mecheryakov liked to repeat, if you have managed to teach a child to use a spoon in human fashion, then all of the remaining human development of this child is simply a matter of technique and patience. By learning to use a spoon, he has already obtained a path both into the world of human thinking and into the world of language. That is, into the world of Kant, Dostoevsky, and Michelangelo.
Уже получил пропуск в мир человеческого мышления.
This leads Mecheryakov to pose the following question. If learning to use a spoon and other everyday objects renders a child human, then why do not similar skills, when they are developed in animals, such as monkeys, transform animal behavior into human behavior? Why do they not render animals human? Can you describe Ilyenkov and Mechelyakov's concept of the social meaning of objects and how they relate to the development of the mind? How does the example of the spoon reveal a universal process?
Как в примере с ложкой обнаруживается этот универсальный процесс?
После погружения от рождения и раннего детства никаких вообще поведенческих стереотипов не обнаруживается. Из этого общепризнанного факта также исходит Мещеряков.
From birth to early childhood, deaf-blind children display no complex behavioral patterns at all. Mesheryakov also acknowledges this well-known fact. He explains this very simply. No activity is observed because there is no activity. The activity of the deaf and blind has to be shaped. It will not appear by itself because there is simply nothing to make it develop.
Мещеряков и Ельденков солидаризируются со всей психологической школой Выгодского, усматривая в критерии.
Mesheryakov and Ilyenkov are in complete agreement with the Vygotsky school, which considers the criteria of human activity, as opposed to zoological activity, to be the fact that the human being, as distinct from the animal, uses objects not present in a usable form in nature, but specially made to serve one or another purpose, whether this is a spoon, speech, or some sort of special language or code.
Педагог берет эту ручонку свою детской ручонкой, которая зовет ловко, пытается зачерпнуть пищу из тарелки. Педагог в буквальном смысле слова руководит.
The spoon is placed in the child's hand, and the teacher takes the child's hand in his own, and using the hand with the spoon clutched in it, tries to pick up some food from the bowl. The teacher guides the child's hand. This is the first step in the shared action of teacher and child.
Позволяет собой руководить и, наконец, развивает, пытается, пусть и неуклюже, слазить с ловкой, самостоятельно.
Ilyenkov observed this procedure a number of times. First the child's hand resisted, then it became guidable, obedient, passive, permitting itself to be guided, and finally it came to life. There were 2 broad windows, each on the outer 2 walls, and within this rectangle there were 12 ordinary one-piece desks. 3 such desks constitute a class, meaning there were actually 4 classes, 4 groups of 3 pupils each in the biology classroom. Each group's desks were pulled together in a C shape, so that the teacher who sat inside the C could reach out and touch each of the 3 pupils. The bedrooms for the students contained 6 or 7 beds each. In my final years there, my bedroom was the smallest. It had 4 beds. Instead of the 5th, there was an ordinary school desk at which I would work in the evenings. I wrote school essays and other stuff on a Braille typewriter. I still have dreams about that building. My eyesight abruptly deteriorated when I was 4. The abrupt deterioration of my hearing was detected when I was 10. I have never been able to distinguish colors in waking life, so I cannot distinguish them in dreams. However, for a long time I could make out the shapes of surrounding objects. Now I cannot, but sometimes this ability comes back in my dreams. When I was brought to the boarding school, it had existed less than a year. It opened in October 1963. It was all new, one big experiment, and there was no bureaucracy. I understand now that I was happy there, the only way one can be happy.
Do you remember when Mecheryakov brought Ilyenkov to the school for the first time?
Вы помните, когда Мещеряков привез Ильенкова в школу в первый раз?
В последнюю пятницу мая 1968 года в педагогическом кабинете
On the last Friday of May 1968, the teledetector, a device for communicating with several deaf-blind people at the same time, was set up in the biology classroom. We sat around the central console, which was manned by the person who wanted to speak to us all.
Судя по крепкому запаху табака, за пультом сидел тот самый дядя.
Someone was sitting at the desk opposite me, someone who smelled of strong tobacco.
Этим дядей был Богданков. Он подвергался в Загорске, обычно вместе с Мещеряковым.
The someone was Ilyenkov. He would show up in Zagorsk, usually along with Mesheryakov, as often as he could, but would sometimes disappear for several months. I was always waiting for him. While we were still university students, several of Ilyenkov's main works and his articles on Mesheryakov's pedagogical methods were reprinted for us on Braille typewriters. Marxism exists for me primarily in Ilyenkov's version. I read Marx, Lenin and Spinoza through Ilyenkov's eyes, perceiving and contemplating them from his stance. This interpretation is quite distant from the semi-official Soviet interpretation, even antagonistic to it in some ways. Ilyenkov and his fellow thinkers were agreed among themselves that it was not Marxism of any sort that had triumphed in the Soviet Union, but positivism. To my mind, there were no Marxists in the Politburo. First of all, I adopted Ilyenkov's theory of talent, and with it all the other content of his work. So for me, the most important thing in Ilyenkov's work is the idea that consciousness, including talent, is acquired through the process of formation and purposeful activity, rather than being genetically innate. Humans are not born persons, but become persons in the process of living, meaning in the process of acting as persons in the course of a lifetime.
именно становление личности в процессе ее человеческой, родовой, социальной жизнедеятельности
It was the
интересовали
emergence of the
Ельянкова
person in
вообще,
the process of
и
its
в том числе
individual,
как
species, and
философия
social life
подтверждения,
that interested
чисто
Ilyenkov
судебной
generally,
педагогики.
including its clearest
Я бы
confirmation
всегда
in
хотел
deaf-blind
быть
psychology.
полноценным не в слепоглухих, а в общечеловеческих пределах. И тут меня очень выручало понимание
I had always
Ельянкова.
wanted to be a full-fledged person in universal rather than deaf-blind terms, and here I was given a huge helping hand by the way Ilyenkov understood not only the specifics of deaf-blindness, but above all the problem of talent, that it is something that can be formed during one's lifetime, and not something biologically innate. Ilyenkov begins his essay, What is a Person?, which was written right before his death, as follows. So what is a person, and where does it come from? It is hardly scholastic considerations that prompt me once again to ask myself this old question, and turn to an analysis of the concept of personality. The fact is that the answer to this question is immediately bound up with the problem of forming on a mass scale a personality of a new, communist type. Of course, such a radical shift in emphasis objectively made Ilyenkov the founder and head of a whole trend in Marxism. That is, from the semi-official viewpoint, he was a revisionist.
The development of consciousness occurs as the individual is confronted with activity from the outside, from other individuals, culture, and society at large. Ilyenkov writes, "It is only in these conditions that the individual is compelled to distinguish himself from his own organic body. Consciousness only arises where the individual is compelled to look at himself from the outside, as if with the eyes of another person, the eyes of all other people, only where he is compelled to correlate his individual actions with the actions of another person, that is to say, only within the framework of collectively performed life activity. As such, following Marx, human essence is the ensemble of all social relations.
Только там, где он вынужден соразмерять свои индивидуальные действия с действиями другого человека, то есть только в рамках совместно осуществляемой жизнедеятельности, пишет Ильенков. Согласно Марксу, человеческая сущность в своей действительности есть ансамбль всех общественных отношений.
марксизме Ильянков перенес акцент с диктатуры пролетариата.
Ilyenkov shifted the emphasis in Marxism from the dictatorship of the proletariat to the formation of the full-fledged, harmoniously developed person, to the construction of communism as a society of total universal giftedness.
Предпосыльческая предпосылка условия, чтобы такое строительство стало возможным.
The dictatorship of the proletariat is only the political precondition that makes this construction possible. Ilyenkov was to become disenchanted with this premise. He was forced to keep this disappointment to himself, but in one of our conversations it came out.
Читата государства и революцию Ленина и материальных съездов КПСС.
Once, while sitting in Ilyenkov's kitchen, I burst into the following tirade. While reading Lenin's State and Revolution and Party Congress proceedings, I noticed that the subject of these proceedings was always developing and strengthening the state, albeit under the label socialist. According to Lenin, however, any state is a machine for oppression, a machine for the domination of some groups in society by other groups. The state is a repressive apparatus for implementing this domination, and it should gradually wither away. The gradual withering away of the state as a repressive apparatus in the course of building communism. But if you develop and strengthen the state, it is unlikely to wither away by itself, I concluded. Ilyenkov listened to my reflections, his head down, all shrunk into himself somehow. But when I came to the conclusion that the state was unlikely to wither away under its own power, Ilyenkov suddenly jumped up and vigorously finger-spelling confirmed my thought. It won't wither away, the beast. Ilyenkov made it clear that he was disappointed in the existing Soviet state as the political precondition of communism. But he could never be disappointed in communism as a society consisting of harmoniously developed persons, a society of total giftedness. Once one has accepted this idea, it is impossible to give up on it, to abandon it, except by abandoning one's own life, along with it, which is what Ilyenkov eventually did by committing suicide.
Эволюция, которую Ильянков совершил в марксизме,
The revolution that Ilyankov made in Marxism was to shift the emphasis from the political preconditions of communism to communism itself, to its psychological and pedagogical construction.
Ильянков был прежде всего космистом. Это значит, что он мыслил с точки зрения человечества как разумной формы жизни.
He was primarily cosmist. This means that he thought in terms of humanity as an intelligent form of life, in terms of the person as a rational being. He thought like a Spinozist, in terms of the thinking body, which exists where the attributes of thought and extension dialectically coincide. If we turn to the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, we see that Marxism is actually a cosmist theory. What is at issue is the cosmic problem of humanity's alienation from itself, the problem of humanity's dehumanization. For Marx, however, class struggle was a historically transitory means of overcoming alienation. It was not yet another redistribution of property, but humanity's discovery of the entire universal fullness of its relations with the world, the attainment, at last, of rationality, and thus the end of prehistory and the beginning of history, the cosmic history of a cosmic, universally intelligent form of life. Private property is to blame for the fact that it reduces every possible relationship humanity has with the rest of the world to one and only one relationship, that of possession. A person can and should be a universal being, a thinking being sensitive to goodness and beauty, but possession makes them envious and nothing more. Our childhood as university students was ending, and with it a glorious era in science was vanishing into the past. I had to remain faithful to that era. Renouncing it meant renouncing myself.
В конце перестройки мне Ильянкова остро не хватало. Я очень нуждался в его поддержке.
At the end of Perestroika, I sorely missed Ilyankov. I really needed his support at a time when official pseudo-Marxism was collapsing. The times had changed in academia. Big Science's keen interest in the Zagorsk experiment had faded. The dominant positivist paradigm had thrown off its Marxist mask.
Короче, Загорский эксперимент кончился. Власти пришли те, против кого
In short,
этот
the Zagorsk
эксперимент
school experiment had ended. The people against whom this experiment had been aimed in the theoretical sense had taken power. In fact, the Zagorsk experiment ended when our quartet finished university. Then each of us had to live in his or her own way.
Я ни в какие партии решил больше не вступать. Решил, что я сам себе партия.
I decided I would not join any parties anymore. I decided I was my own party, like Marx and Engels, who were of course convinced communists, theorists of communism, before they joined the Communist League. The point is not membership after all, but outlook.
Я испытываю глубочайшее разочарование до человечества. Судя по тому, что творится в Украине, далеко нам до разумности.
Right now, I am profoundly disappointed with humanity. Judging by what is happening in Ukraine, we are far from being intelligent. Of course, according to Marx, until communism is built, humanity has no history, only prehistory. Consequently, humanity as such does not exist. In fact, as long as prehistory continues.
Но вот вопрос, начнут ли когда-нибудь превалировать общечеловеческие, общепланетные, а не русско-национальные интересы? Станет ли когда-нибудь человечество человечеством? Начнется ли его история?
But the question is, will universal planetary interests ever begin to prevail rather than narrow national interests? Will humanity become humanity someday? Will its history ever commence? Or will we perish in prehistoric convulsions, continuing from the birth pangs in which a social structure worthy of an intelligent life form is born, to the agony of a dying biological species? There is no humanity in the sense of an intelligent life form. There are no persons in the sense of intelligent beings. What there has been, and else will be in the foreseeable future, is a bestial community of enviers.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for staying. Yeah, to begin this conversation, I've just thought that what we've seen also, in a way, the Soviet 68, and this kind of behavior of clumping to the touching sculptures, behaving in city in that way was completely, of course, dissident. And if you imagine the Soviet context in the 60s, and obviously we also celebrate 50 years after 68, and it's also a nice occasion to kind of link and to see the kind of diverse context of global 68, if I may put it that way. Yeah, well, so we will try to be maybe as quick as possible, right? Yeah, I think, yeah, since I watched film number of times, I think maybe what I really like about the film in terms of its artistic form is that it in a certain way, I think it questions the conventional mode of doing, first of all, artistic research, and second of all, an essay film. Yeah, and the way it deals with the problem of critique and research is quite interesting, in my opinion. Although it's massively based on the method of artistic research, so just to mention, Emmanuel did archival research in Moscow, but then he might tell a little bit more on this. So then he appropriates archival materials, then he did some field work, and what is also important, this interview with Suvorov is based on their collaborative, so the script they wrote is collaborative. So it's also quite kind of in an interesting way how he engaged the protagonist into the production of the film. And the drums you hear, just because sometimes you don't see the final titles are very... So the drums you hear is Suvorov himself plays these drums, and then it was recorded in his apartment, and it's a soundtrack. It's Suvorov himself, the protagonist, plays them. So given all of that, and plus the very serious study of Ilyenkov, deafblind, Soviet pedagogy and psychology, Vygotsky, and many other things. So in total, it's a lot of elements of artistic research. But normally these tools of research, they would serve as a kind of grand task to, let's say, map and describe a particular historical period, or do a case study in order to show a kind of genealogy of certain history and the certain effects in today's society. And the typical scenario of such artistic research would also include a critique of Soviet Union. You would have very authoritarian voiceover saying you something. And typical example would be, of course, quite a brilliant film, but full of these kind of cliches which we today maybe associate with essay film. The film of Chris Marker, The Last Bolshevik. So Suvorov actually a great example, could be, right? Another great example of this Last Bolshevik. And then you have the Chris Marker talks about a Soviet filmmaker, Medvedkin, how he still keeps this fidelity to October Revolution, and how there is some kind of strange elements which Marker doesn't understand, but then tries to reflect on this fidelity and the collapse of Soviet Union and all of that. And you have the authority of this Western man who comes and who kind of, contemplates. And this would be a kind of exemplary of then artistic research and essay film in some respect. So what I really like that this film undoes this kind of genre and this kind of approach. I would say what it does instead is kind of that what you do here, if to use, again, Michel Foucault was mentioned earlier, if to use his terminology, you construct the positivity of Soviet knowledge. You just give this holistic image of the Soviet 68 without giving the kind of authority above the material. So material unfolds itself. Yeah, of course it's but you don't exercise this typical critique, the typical critique and typical narrative. And I just wonder, maybe you can, I think it's interesting in this respect, your relation to this, the kind of genre and this modality of criticism, which also a kind of question of what is artistic research and how you manage, what was your relation to Suvorov and yeah.
Hello. Thanks. Yes, lots in there. I think, I think I didn't really. I mean, I didn't really want to make a critical inquiry into the history of the Zagorsk school. That's something I kind of realized quite early on. But rather, I kind of wanted to make an affirmative film. I wanted to make a film that was more something I would do with him rather than about him. I'm talking about Suvorov now. And that meant, of course, like, you know, I was in dialogue with him for over a year before we started filming and before we even, you know, constructed anything that had to do with the film. And, you know, throughout this dialogue, that also, you know, I more and more kind of accepted a lot of his kind of point of view into this history and kind of wanted to really take that on and like stand and kind of like try and tell that story through his eyes, you know. That also, I mean, I think so in one way I wanted to make like an affirmative film together with him rather than about him. On the other hand, I also, you know, in the same way as the spoon is kind of explained as this example of a mediating object, as a tool of mediation, I also kind of wanted to think, like, you know, when I found the archive material especially, like I really felt that there's this kind of, that the film itself could be a kind of mediating object in a sense. You know, if one takes that, you know, that the cultural historical perspective seriously, like that, you know, how objects, how we are formed in relationship to our you know, objects and other people and kind of, then that also meant that I had to trust in the material. Like, so I think for me, like both Suvorov and the archive footage, which are the two kind of components in the film, both of them are something that I felt like kind of I had to kind of see as more as friends, like as more as kind of comrades or something, rather than something that I kind of wanted to kind of, yeah. And that meant trying to understand it. It meant like, even if I didn't agree with everything, we had like discussions and kind of came to some middle ground or something. And that's kind of where the film, that's where what the film comes out of, yeah. I mean, I can tell you a little bit more about the archive footage as well. I mean, it's when I found it in the archive, there was no information about it really. It's made sometime in the late 60s, early 70s. I think it's probably shot during many different times. There's no author credited. The only information that was attached to it was the title, Talking Hands, and that's the title of my film as well. And I think not knowing, not having that information also allowed for a kind of more, like looking at the material in a more, like trying to understand what the material was telling me in a sense, and like I said, really trusting in the material as a mediating object somehow. And for me, there was a few things that really came out quite strong, and like one of them was the kind of the sense of the materiality in the material, and there was this kind of two levels that I felt were really strong. One was the surfaces that the people in the films engaged with, like when they engaged in the city, and the other one was the surface of the film itself. So the kind of overexposure, the graininess, and like the kind of double exposure sometimes. So you had these two surfaces that was really kind of strong in the material, and I think between those two surfaces, the narrative, the history kind of unfolds itself. And the narrative that I felt was strong in the archive material as well was this kind of, it was almost like the archive material itself, because it goes from this, the way that it's a bit, the material in the film is a bit shorter than the original. The original archive is like 90 minutes. But I started by just editing out like some things that were repeating itself, some things that was like really poor quality, you couldn't see anything. So, but I tried to keep the actual structure of the how it was put together as much as I could. And so the material like starts with these very scientific educational shots, as we see with like early examples of children interacting with different tools and objects. And then it becomes more and more playful, and you know the camera becomes more playful, and they start moving into the city. It becomes more experimental, and there was something in this in itself that almost suggested this, you know, that the individual, like, so you're not, like, we are not born like free, you know, but conditioned by this very harsh environment, and it's only through these kind of social mediations and these objects like that can mediate social historical meanings that we can somehow develop, and this kind of, and from this kind of social collective, the individual can emerge. So it was like, instead of seeing the collective as this kind of thing that would somehow repress the individual, it was the individual kind of came out, like the collective had to be there for the individual to kind of emerge. And I thought that was something that the material was suggesting, and I don't know, you know, I was kind of, that was something that I was like thinking about a lot. It was just in the footage somehow. And yeah, so I tried to keep this narrative there, and it was something that like I then engaged with in the discussion with Suvorov.
Yeah, maybe let me go back to, or do you want to add something?
No, go ahead.
Let me go back to the scene with the spoon. I thought about Alexei's point about this event or transition from finite to infinite. But here it's something else happens through what in Soviet psychology they called shared social activity. That this child who doesn't understand what is the food, what is the spoon, what is this, yeah, and then the teacher slowly tries to show what is this, and first. It's very forceful movement, how he plays the spoon. But then eventually this event happens. The child starts using the spoon. So this very eventfulness when then as it says later, that this is the birth of consciousness, that consciousness emerges from the simple mediation, the social mediation that others mediate, and through that you internalize the social relation of the teacher, and you start using spoon, and you can eat, yeah. And if you can eat, then of course, as it says in the film, then you can read Hegel, you can enjoy Goethe and other things, yeah. But you have to start from this basic events of how to use tool. Yeah, so I think it's this kind of eventfulness which is also bridges this kind of dialectical dialectical Hegelian moment in Ilyenkov also, and the Spinozist kind of ontology all together. But then this dialectics of body and thought, which also Alexei was bringing in his talk, that the also very strange, bizarre interpretation of Spinoza, because Ilyenkov says that there is a dialectical relationship between body and thought. And when they coincide, then there is this kind of eventfulness and fullness and holistic fullness or whatever. While, of course, for Spinoza, this is not quite the case. But you've been bringing, obviously, this concept of thinking body as well as ability and what would mean this holistic fullness. How maybe you can a little bit elaborate on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was, you know, when I like started reading Ilyenkov and trying to look into this history, you know, the emphasis on disability and ability was something that surprised me a little bit. I didn't really think of Soviet Union as a place where this was kind of seen as like such a, you know, was valorized in this way, and it was really fascinating. And you know, for this, like, because this idea of ability seemed to be like almost in the kind of heart of communism, like so. You know, as Marx famously described it, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Like what Ilyenkov seemed to ask then is that what do we mean by ability and need? You know, in this context, and I, you know, for him it's clear that ability is something that you know, really it's really something that comes from without. You know, it's not something innate. It's something that is like really developed during one's lifetime. Okay, I can just read a short quote here, maybe, if that's helpful. So the entirety of an ability is given to the individual from without by the world of objects and people, and the ability is developed through the individual's assimilation of the experience of other people, of modes of changing the surrounding world. So I think like this like idea that you know, Ilyenkov doesn't deny like biological preconditions, but he argues that like claims that start from them often tend to lead, like that like only are based on them, often tend to lead to some defensive and kind of reactionary positions. So like, and in a way of like neutralizing, you know, what he calls like historically shaped and inherited modes of division of labor, you know. So of course, like one can think of like, you know, I don't know. Can't come up with an example. Well, like I don't know, the role of women. Like you are good at you're only good at working in, you know, in the kitchen because this is like natural, and it's not I mean like historical mode of division of labor that's been inherited and so on. So this is like, so this is really something that he kind of pushes and kind of like tries to bring further, that ability itself is like this universal possibility. I mean, this is in the film a lot, like this universal possibility of developing our full potential and talent, you know, as social beings. So it's like an understanding that it implies, like it almost implies also the opposite, like disability is connected to these inherited modes of division of labor. So it's like, you know, it's a capitalist social relations. So for Ilyenkov, like the norm is for man is precisely talent, and by saying that talent is like a rarity, like this is a quote from him, like we simply dump onto Mother Nature our own guilt, our own inability to create for each individual all the external conditions for his development to the highest level of talent. So. And this is the main task of communist transformation. I mean, when he's writing in this period, so he does not, like again, like he does not deny like physical impairments, but like separate it from ability, you know. And ability belongs to the same social category as seeing, as thinking, you know. And as Suvorov says, like even humanity itself, you know, does not yet exist. You know, even humanity is part of this similar
Can I briefly
understanding.
add something to
Yeah,
this?
go ahead.
With regards to disability and physical kind of.
Yeah.
So for Vygotsky, for instance, this sort of disability, it just means that there is some kind of biological material that can be mediated socially via particular objects or tools. So for instance, through what we perceive as organic, for him it's not organic, it's just a material which could be reshaped. for instance, via prosthesis, if you don't have some, if you miss a leg, or through the tactile writing and reading, if you're not able to hear or to see. So that's how also this idea of mediation and social mediation via objects of or even particular historical forms became crucial and totally reconfigures what we understand by physical, biological, or kind of that it tries to rethink what is human in its essence through this theory of mediation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like that separation of mind and body and like and thinking and feeling and all these kind of things. Like that's like exactly. But it's connecting that also to the to communism and to the these historical modes of division of labor. I mean, I think that's also what's so fascinating to think about. Like it's almost as if like it's suggested that instead of we think of this able-bodied male industrial worker as the communist subject, but it's almost as if like the communist subject is like both the communist and the object of communist transformation is the deaf and blind person in this context. But maybe we should.
Yeah, I think we should open the floor because it's quite late.
Yeah.
So again, thanks for staying.
If people want to move forward, please do. There's lots of seats very close to us.
Any questions, comments for Alexei or for Maria or Emmanuel?
First of all, it's really powerful, the footage and the film itself. And the question is, it was made as a propaganda film, was it? Or was it made as an educational film? What was the ideology behind the film itself?
I don't know. Like it was, I don't think it wasn't shown very much. And the first part, from the extracts that I have found that describe what I think is the film, the first part was made in this kind of educational purpose, so to show examples of like education for other, in terms of like as part of an educational purposes. But the film wasn't really edited because all the clips in the film just come after each other, so there's like no real like, it was never really finished. It has the title card, like Talking Hands, but it has nothing else, like no information at the end of it with who does what. So basically, I think the original purpose was educational, maybe scientific. You can record some exercises and like look at them over and over again in order to see some details and like understand some like interactions. But as you can tell, like the film leaves this mood quite quickly. It's like only the first quarter of the film that keeps this kind of aesthetics. Then it goes on and becomes more, like these the handheld, and they go into the city and so on and so on. So it's like. It's not, yeah.
I think it's one of the quotes in the film that you chose towards the end that kind of questions.
Yeah, Levitin.
Yeah, questions the conditions under which, like,
the
context under which it was, or like the truthfulness, and it makes it look so easy.
So this is like Karl Levitin. He was watching Mesherakov, who was one of the psychologists at the school. Did like a private screening just with him and showed him the film. And I am not even like 100% sure this is the same film, but it's the only film that I found, so I think it's the same film. And there's other passages where he also describes some scenes in it, so I'm pretty sure it's the same film. But yeah, so he shows him this film, and then Levitin sees this like more aesthetic dimension in the material, and he kind of thinks that this is also like the birth of consciousness and all that. But then there is this like other kind of comment as well, which is like that the film produces its own film truth. You know, it condenses time. And I think going back to that idea of what I was trying to say before about an affirmative film, I mean, I think for me, that's actually a potential, you know, because I wanted to make this I wanted the film to be affirmative. So it's not a problem.
Opened the door for you.
It's not a problem for me, yeah. But, yeah.
It just what your last comment just reminded me of a question that I had during the film that I was asking Alexei. That I think Ilyankov said something about positivism in relation to communism, and then to the Politburo. I was wondering what this. I was wondering if you could say more about this. It was a kind of flashing moment.
We can share the question. It's a big discourse within the Soviet post-Stalinist context that for Ilyankov and many others, but maybe the debate goes back to 20s within the Soviet psychology as a battle first against Ivan Pavlov and his theory of reflex, which sees a human nature or human being as this kind of mechanistic mechanism of receiving signals and stimuli. And then on top, it's like two very simple machines which receive signals. And then there've been this debate how this leads to kind of very bad semi-fascist, you know, consequences, this kind of theory. And already in Lev Vygotsky, who've been in 20s, a very famous psychologist, but who have been starting with these kind of questions of disability as well and pedagogy in 1920s. So he already launches this battle against positivism, behaviorism, and I think then Stalinism was a peak point for people like Ilyankov associated, and then for others like Mikhail Lifshitz, for example, as this kind of this line of positivism with this behaviorism, Pavlov and Alexander Bogdanov would be for them another example, a philosopher and founder of prolet cult. I don't agree completely with that, but this is another question. So, and this positivism was the main for them problem of why communists failed and of the tragedy of Stalinism. And then Ilyankov fights with this in education system and elsewhere. So this is this big debate. And then about intelligence and cybernetics, and it's huge in 60s, 70s.
I can also link a question of positivism, I think, with this text of Cosmology of the Spirit, which is also like a founded footage, like because it was published in 80s randomly after his death. So it was also sort of this founded footage of the text, in a sense. Positivism, according even to any dictionary definition, is a refusal of any speculation, refusal of metaphysics. So this is positivism. It's like trust only in facts, which we can see. The facts, for example. And this is inscribed in how capitalist society functions, which is based on facts and rejection of any sort of more speculative, more distant view on the reality, which implied in this sort of other perspective. So in this sense, positivism is a sort of rejection of anything which transcends the current order of things. So it was a big discourse in Soviet critique of mostly Western or so developments in Western philosophy as this sort of critique of positivism, which actually is the same as Frankfurt School was criticizing sort of traditional theory or positive. It was a big debate on both sides, I mean, in Western history. But I think that generally for Ilyankov, this was a very strong debate, because a very important debate, because positivism meant exactly rejection of communism, and the positivism meant exactly a refusal of this sort of speculative hypothesis of communism. If if we formulate this in a sort of like Alain Badiou also uses the term hypothesis, also in a speculative way. So it's like communism is hypothesis and it's speculative proposition, which also paradoxically, as though it is hypothesis or speculative proposition, it's also somehow tackles the most profound grounds of how our world is constructed. And probably if we won't follow this hypothesis, this world will turn not just in a sort of polluted, toxicated planet, but also in a sort of ground zero thing. So this is a sort of positivity.
Yeah, I have a question about, is it possible that Ilkov was also influenced by ideas of Russian cosmism, such as, Vernadsky, Chizhevsky, and I mean, I even see some parallels in his thought to Teilhard de Chardin, and sort of this idea of omega point, right? Sort of this final stage of human existence, and so on and so forth.
Yes, agree. That actually in this film I was watching it also a couple of times, and then I finally noticed that this Suvorov, this pupil of Ilyenkov, also characterized his thought as a sort of cosmist thought in a sense, I think there is commonalities and there are some differences because cosmism, for example, for cosmos is like, how to say, it was about, again, I'm not a big expert in cosmos, but according to Fedorov, and now I know that what Anton is very interested in all this topic of cosmism. And I initially contributed this previous version of this paper for an issue was somehow related to cosmism. I had no time to mention all this connection. But I think there are some differences because Ilyenkov's speculative proposition is rather goes against, of course, it's the same level of a little bit crazy speculation about the future of the universe. And it could be probably another film based on this hypothesis, sci-fi, or I can even probably contribute to writing a scenario. It would be, good film probably. But I think for cosmists, it was rather less linked to communism, but this sort of the question of immortality, the question of how to save humanity. For Ilyenkov, it's quite different. It's rather how to be less selfish and how to destroy humanity for the sake of sort of material ontology of the world. So it's a kind of, and it was also funny that this text of cosmology was somehow unofficially circulating in Soviet Union according to some stories, and it gave a sort of occasion for the Soviet dissidents to blame not just Ilyenkov but communists, saying that the secret goal of communism is to destroy humanity. It's like the Soviets, all these people, they are just want to involve us in this sort of self-suicidal narrative, and so on. So I think that there are differences, and it was, as I said, the whole Soviet discourse in the 50s, which somehow was linked to cosmism, like Fedorov or Tsiolkovsky, maybe Vernadsky, but it was rather, how to say, it was linking this strictly to the question of communism, which cosmism didn't. It was rather more about this sort of, also very interesting speculative spiral, but somehow I wouldn't say attached so much to this sort of, and also Ilyenkov was a classical philosopher. Cosmist, I think Fedorov probably writes something about Kant or this sort of classical European tradition of philosophy. I read this very superficially, Fedorov text, but I think Ilyenkov was in classical tradition of philosophy. He was a very good expert in Kant, Hegel. He wrote, about many Hegel's work. So he constructs his argument based on this legacy, not on this sort of kind of others. And Russian, especially, I don't understand word Russian here, because I think he was a kind of universalist thinker, which wasn't much concerned about being Russian or not Russian, or I don't know.
Okay. One, but maybe really very short, because we are out of time and running over.
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking about this opening shot of the film. You know, you seem to be comparing kind of the images of the film to the tactile kind of embodied knowledge that the blind students are, you know, engaging in the film. And I was just thinking, you know, how can film kind of mediate this kind of deprivileging of the visual that the film seems to be about without kind of reinscribing it as a visual medium? You know, if you thought about that.
Yeah, I think it was one of the first things I thought about when making the film. It's like, how do you make a film about something that that seems to suggest an understanding of seeing that is not based on the eye, right? And yeah, I think that's a challenge. I think I never resolved it really. I think it's a kind of contradiction that exists in there, and it kind of still is. But there's certain things I try to do with, like the material that I shot is based on, you know, it's mostly based on close-ups. It's a very gradual kind of where the camera pulls back and you actually see the space and the people in it. So, and the idea of the close-up is like, you know, I try to like, and the relationship between the close-up and the sound is that I try to like make the appearance of the image outside of the image. So like how everything that is outside of the frame becomes like kind of something that gets constructed in your mind slowly through the close-up, through the fragments. And that for me was like a way of thinking about, okay, so the image is something that's constructed through, you know, through like activity or through kind of like these social relations rather than something that happens like immediately through the eye. In the archive material that was different, but I think in the archive material I really tried to kind of think, like again, like think about these two surfaces, like the surface of the film and the surface of that they engage with, you know, and I a lot of what I that space between those two surfaces, what I tried to like really add or emphasize that was through the sound, through the audio. Yeah, but yeah, I think it's like unresolved in the film. But I'm glad in Ilyenkov or in general. Yeah.
When Emmanuel described this method, Suvorov said that this is perfect, that you can't see anything because it's like Marxist movement from abstract to concrete. Only at the end you see the face and Suvorov himself. So you travel through this kind of formation also through the film because you can't see, and then gradually the picture clears.
We had these conversations. I had this conversation with Suvorov when I was making the film, like try to explain like the idea of shooting and so on.
Well, thank you, Emmanuel, Maria, and Alexei. Thank you all for sticking around and being so great.